Hello and welcome from the European Parliament in Brussels, less than 2 months before the European elections. With me here in the studio are British MEPs Richard Ashworth from the European Conservatives and Reformists and Michael Cashman from the Socialists. Very warm welcome to you both. We're focusing today on the United Kingdom, trapped in ambivalence about many aspects of the UK's relationship with the EU. And linking up with us from the UK and Brussels, three expert contributors. Walter Butcher, Director of Research and Forecasting at Colliers UK, Peter Klepper, Head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, and Richard Templer, Professor of Chemistry at Imperial College London. Richard Ashworth, let's turn straight to business and ask you, if you look in particular at the recent rise of populism in Europe, one only has to look at France and the UK to get a good example of that. What do you think is at stake, very briefly, before we start proper in these elections?
I don't think that anybody would deny Europe has to change. It's going on all around the world. You have to keep up with the pace of change, otherwise you'll quickly become history. To what extent and how fast can Europe change? And is Britain's place best suited within the European Union, being the agent of change, or, as some would argue, outside the European Union, going it alone?
Michael Cashman, over to you with the same question. I mean, you have to distinguish yourself from that broad conservative message in the Socialists. What do you say to your electorate?
My fear, and I'm not standing for re-election, is that if we don't get the right parties, pro-European parties, elected to the Parliament, we will see 28 countries that are working against one another rather than working with their collective clout, and we lose a social Europe and we lose a Europe based on fundamental human values.
But it looks like we're all set fair for that very scenario that you fear if you look at the rise of populism, as I was saying at the beginning, in France and the UK and many other European countries.
Paul, the rise of populism is based a great deal on the propaganda and misinformation about the way the European Union works. And central to that is that we need to open up the Council of Ministers so that people actually see what their governments do in secret in Europe. The election campaign, we've got everything to fight for, everything to gain, and the polls, I think, if they say the right wing, the extreme right are on the rise, it's a challenge to all of us.
Okay, we'll thrash out more, no doubt, during the course of this programme. Let's turn first of all to our guests and allow them and ask them to put questions to our MEPs. We're going to go first of all to Walter Butcher, a director at Colliers UK, which is an American-based company with big property and investment business interests across Europe's borders, if I'm right, Walter, there. I'd like to give you 20-30 seconds maximum to put your position and then to put a question to the MEPs.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, look, we are a cross-border business, and to fragment Europe in any way would absolutely fragment our business, increase our cost base, and make it very difficult to deliver the sort of seamless services that we give to our global client base. I think from my perspective, and certainly from the company's perspective, all we're looking for is certainty, predictability, and consistency. So I think the question I'd have for the MPs to begin with is, look, is this EU referendum really going to happen, or is this really about the UK positioning itself to opt back out of the social chapter, or does this have something to do with maintaining London's financial preeminence?
Richard Ashworth, that is a blindingly obvious question for you first.
Well, I don't think, Walter, that holds any fears for anybody. I've talked earlier about the need for change in the European Union, and David Cameron's got some very clear views on the changes he wants to see. These are just common sense changes, the changes which might affect you. For example, completion of the single market, completion of the services directive, to make it easier to do that cross-border trade which you want to do, and to make the European Union more competitive. Now, the determination of the Prime Minister is that, one, you'd negotiated, and on the basis of that negotiation, then put it to the people to give it a democratic legitimacy.
Does that mean that there's a possibility that if David Cameron's negotiations on the reforms that he's set out for the European Union, if those negotiations are successful and he's able to go to the British people and say, look what we got out of Europe, that the referendum idea would be cancelled?
No, I don't think it would be cancelled. It would give it, it's the right thing to be doing. The kind of reforms we're talking about, it's not earth-shattering stuff. It is actually just the common sense reforms that it's not just the United Kingdom wants to see, all the other member states, actually, or most of them, are wanting to see as well.
Michael, what are your thoughts to Walter's question?
Well, Walter, I think it is peculiarly a British position being played out. And sadly, I disagree with Richard, because I think the statement on a referendum and the commitment to a referendum is more about keeping certain wings of the Conservative Party happy and trying to shut them up. And of course, they won't shut up. The renegotiations that Cameron's talked about, he hasn't even spelled out which areas he wishes to negotiate or renegotiate, clawing back the so-called powers. So I see it as a distraction to set an arbitrary referendum for 2017 when you haven't even got half of the countries on board, let alone the other 27 which you need for the treaty changes. Not even setting out what you want to renegotiate is a complete distraction, creates uncertainty, and I think keeps inward investment away from the United Kingdom, because investors want long-term certainty.
Richard Ashworth, would you like to respond to those questions? This sort of round denial of
well, I do, and I suppose it would be inappropriate for David Cameron to show his hand at this stage and say what it is he wants to renegotiate, but for what it's worth, I have a 6-point plan. I have a plan. Formalise the rights of the non-Eurozone countries, particularly within the single market. Refocus resources so that we put all our efforts and resources into jobs, growth and competitiveness. But
Richard, this isn't renegotiation. Nobody would disagree.
These are the changes we want to see, Michael. Just let me finish.
Let us be honest. David Cameron really wants to create a kind of offshore sweatshop of Britain where workers do not have the same rights, because he talks about the burden of regulation on employers. Good employers don't need the burden of regulation, they do it. Bad employers do, and that's why we're seeing people trying to circumvent all of the rules on paternity pay, maternity pay, health and safety at work, non-discrimination at work.
You don't know this any more than I know it. Look, I'm saying about the changes we'd like to see. Let me continue. We want more urgency into completing bilateral trade deals. For example, trade deal with the USA. Extremely important. Reinforcing neighbourhood policies.
Agreed.
Issues like the Ukraine make it more urgent than ever. Yes, and repatriation of some powers, for example, justice and home affairs, domestic fiscal policy and social policy. That's a matter of subsidiarity. We want that reinforced.
Social policy. So it is about taking away social rights away from British workers.
No, Michael, you're putting words in my mouth. I didn't say that. David Cameron hasn't said that. You're jumping to presumptions. You can't do that. That's dangerous.
Okay,
I'm going to go back to you, Walter, as an American living in the UK, and I just want to get your overview of how it is in the UK. I mean, you look at the politics, you look at the amount of heat that Europe raises in the UK, perhaps with some perplexity. Do you think instinctively that that Britain will ever come to terms with being a member of the European Union, or is it forever condemned to live with this ambivalence?
My own view is that the UK originally signed up to the EU to be part of the customs union, and that's the economic part of it. Now, the social policy, from what I can see, going back to what the Maastricht Treaty, that's sort of where the trouble began. And it was in '97 when we opted back in that all the issues seemed to start bubbling up. Look, I'm social at heart, you could say, but equally, looking strictly from history, I would suggest to you that the UK would be happiest to just strictly be in an economic trade union and be done with it.
Okay, well, let's turn to one of the other most incendiary questions of the UK in the European Union, that of immigration. Peter Kleppe, head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, is with us now. That's a think tank based in Brussels. Peter, in 20 seconds, perhaps you could put your position to us and then your question to the MEPs.
Sure. So by taking the UK to court over the right to reside test, which is a test the British government imposes on newcomers from within the EU to make sure there are no undue strains on the social system, isn't the European Commission thereby attempting to micromanage social policies of member states, and doesn't it thereby actually undermine popular support for what is a great thing, open borders?
Thank you very much indeed for that question. We sort of lost the audio a little bit there, and so it didn't all come through, but I should explain this is the intention, I think, at this stage that the European Commission has to take the United Kingdom to the European Court of Justice over its attempts to alter migration policy. Let me start with you, Michael Cashman, first. What do you think about what Peter has just put to you?
In a way, what I find really interesting is I think there's been roughly, the latest figures, 2.34 million EU migrants to the UK. and there's approximately 2.2 million migrants from the UK living in other parts of Europe. And that's one of the major benefits, the freedom to set up a business in another country, to work there, to study, to retire. Absolutely fantastic. And if we start tinkering with one of the fundamental principles of the EU, freedom of movement, I think sooner or later other EU countries will turn around and say to the United Kingdom, we're not altering this, if you don't like it, go. And we must also get around to the whole issue of the defamation and the misrepresentation of people who go to countries like the United Kingdom to work.
Richard Ashworth on this same question.
I think the whole principle of the single market is about freedom of movement of goods, services, capital and people. We welcome migration within the European Union, but we stress that while it is the rights of free movement, it is not necessarily about the rights of free access to benefits which are not qualified for or not earned. And I think that that is at the heart of the issue, whether it's perception or not, that British people feel that there's a sense of unfairness, that people are accessing full rate benefits in the United Kingdom which have not been earned.
Okay, Peter, there you have a sort of fairly comprehensive answer to your question. Well, you wanted to ask another question, yeah?
Well, just a small remark to Mr. Cashman. This is not a matter of the UK versus all the other member states. As you've probably noticed, in Britain but also in Holland, in Germany and Denmark, there's a huge debate about this issue. And I think you're absolutely right in saying that it's a minimal issue. You know, it's not a major financial problem or something. But it definitely, and the fact that the Commission is trying to abuse the beautiful principle of free movement by trying to micromanage social policies is, in my view, quite irresponsible.
But Peter, the European Commission cannot abuse the principle. The European Commission can ask its legal service whether the principle is being upheld. If it's not, it has to take legal action. But you know, the rise of this debate is a lot to do with the rhetoric around migrants, that somehow people from other countries come to take something away from the people who live there. And a lot of the information they get is misinformation. And I look at the United Kingdom and the contribution from migrants and the way it's enriched our culture, let alone our industries, we should celebrate.
What do you think, Richard Ashworth, about the hysteria that there is in the media, particularly in the Eurosceptic media in the UK, towards this whole immigration question? If you take at face value what both you and what Michael Cashman is saying, you know, in terms of the value that migrants can bring to a country and the opportunities Britain has to have its own migrants.
Because I don't believe at heart there's a real problem with European Union citizens exercising their right of free movement. But I do believe that the problem which people identify in the United Kingdom is non-EU citizens. In other words, people who've come from Middle East, from Far East.
Not if you look
Africa.
at Romania, Bulgaria at the beginning of this year, if you look at the problems that Roma people have in terms of their perception in the UK. You know, it was focused at the beginning of this year on the perceived threat of tens of thousands of Romanians and Bulgarians arriving.
Yes, but I'm sorry, but this was just rabble-rousing.
Yeah, but that's what I'm asking.
Rabble-rousing.
What do you think about
by the far right, there was this mass invasion coming on the 1st of January. Look out. Well, the Romanian embassy said in the event 28 people turned up.
Thank you very much for that. Before we turn to Richard Templer from Imperial College in London, I'm going to read a couple of comments that we've had on our Facebook page. Beek Mull says it would be a huge mistake for the UK to stay out of Europe because it would lead to Britain losing its leading role in making policies work here. Steve Dark says, I would rather Great Britain decide our own rights than have them imposed by an unelected, undemocratic, tax-thieving, desperate bunch of megalomaniac federalists. Okay, well, we kind of know where you stand there. And one final thought, Kim On-Fee says he would rather be governed by a just autocracy in the EU than an unjust democracy in the UK. Okay, well, let's move on to our final guest, who's Richard Templer at Imperial College in London, Professor Richard Templer. Can I ask you, first of all, Richard, just to set out your position before you put the question to that you'd like to put to MEPs?
I'm part of a thing called a knowledge innovation community. Our mission is to develop technologies that combat the causes of climate change. The climate kick has created significant benefits for UK companies. And in fact, a month ago, one of those companies called Palm Tree Oasis that does extreme weather event modeling was launched in regards to its impact on the insurance industry. It got a lot of press around the world, and what was really remarkable was the absence of any recognition of in the UK press of the EU's central role. I don't think it's just the press. I think politics and politicians have a role here as well.
Yes.
So I kind of want to challenge you guys and say, okay, the press is what it is. But perhaps you guys don't do enough.
We can shout as much as we like about our success, but if it's not reported, then nobody will hear about it. But you're absolutely right that politicians are part of the problem. I've never heard a Prime Minister or a government minister stand up and say, we're introducing these measures based on the work done by our members of the European Parliament. For instance, on bringing down something as simple as roaming charges from £1 a minute down to now something like, I think, 13.5 euro cents, or standing up and saying the work that we're doing on climate change, the work that we're doing in order to bring down emissions is as a result of. What happens is government ministers and its parties of all colours claim the success and blame anything that's unpopular on Europe.
On this whole question, to answer the question about climate change, I strongly believe that we, this generation, owe it to future generations to change the model of the way we run our lives, because actually it is the inheritance we're leaving our grandchildren, and we, at present rate, need to be pretty ashamed of what we're going to leave for our grandchildren. But the United Kingdom has got a really good story to tell here, because climate change, whether you agree with it or not, it is an opportunity. And where Britain does very well indeed. Our research departments, our universities do an extraordinarily good job. And may I say, that's reflected in the funding we get from the European Union. Research and development from the European Union, the UK receives twice as much funding as the average European country does.
Richard, can I ask you a question? I mean, you're a consumer of Europe, and a grateful consumer of Europe, it seems, stuck in a very Eurosceptic country. What would you say MEPs should be saying to the electorate in order to win them over on the European idea that Europe can offer something beneficial to the UK that might stand in the way of the expected triumph of populists, of UKIP in the UK?
I think the UK has a voice which has value, and certainly in the area of innovation, which I'm in, and entrepreneurship, I think we have serious things and useful things to say. I also think that we have influence, and if we step away and give indications that we don't trust, we don't want to be fighting inside the EU, we want to sort of be outside throwing brickbats, it lowers our influence. All that fine science that you were talking about, Richard, it gets lost. The UK becomes an irrelevancy.
Okay, we have time for one more nugget of wisdom from each of our contributors and each of our MEPs, literally in 20 seconds, no more than that. In the next parliamentary session, the thing I would like most is, Walter Birchall, let me start off with you.
Well, I'd like to say continuity, but I think I like this immigration issue. That really needs to be resolved. There's two components. One is that I think it really does feed into innovation. Certainly what we've seen on the backside of London and Shoreditch is a plethora of people coming from all over the EU generating all sorts of new ideas. We cannot stand still. Economy has to move forward if we're going to be productive. But the other part of this, and I throw this back out to is it Peter with the immigration, look, you have an aging population in the UK and other Western democratic countries. Listen, we're going to be fighting for immigrants in another 5 years when suddenly people realize just how old our population has become.
Okay, Peter Klepper, that's a throw to you.
Well, first of all, of course, I'm very much pro-immigration. I'm just not in favor of the Commission abusing it to go into social policy. But what I would like to see is European Parliament that's basically taking whatever happens at the EU level more into account in terms of spending. I think the EU budget should be a high priority for the European Parliament. We have not really seen a lot of interest coming from the Parliament to actually monitor.
Well, you should look at the debates more often, I'm sorry.
Okay, let me pass on now to Richard Templer. Richard, what is at the very top of your wish list for the next 5 years?
At the very top of my wish list, grandfather, is that the Parliament focus on climate change. It's going to be. I'm a scientist, and you know, I really want people to stop thinking that this isn't for real. It is. The impacts, the social, economic impacts, are going to be really significant, and politicians have got to stand up and start being more visionary and less managerial about this issue.
Michael Cashman, let me pass the same question over to you. I know you're not standing, you won't be an MEP from May 2014, but what would you like to see your colleagues in Parliament achieve?
I'd like to see them achieve growth, jobs, prosperity, a recognition that 28 countries working together can achieve much, much more than by acting alone, but central to getting rid of this anti-Europeanism and the misrepresentation of Europe is that the Council of Ministers, those ministers from the 28 governments, when they come together, they meet, they deliberate and they vote in public.
Richard Ashworth, the last word goes to you on that same question.
Well, Michael's right. The headline still has got to be growth and jobs. That's the most urgent, pressing need. And alongside that runs competitiveness of the European economy for all sorts of reasons. And one of the correspondents said there that we have an aging population. Competitiveness will be the big issue. And to do that, we need to complete the single market. We need a single market in energy. We want a single market in services. And finally, we need to complete the digital economy. That would bring enormous wealth to all people right throughout Europe.
Okay, many thanks to everybody who's participated in this hangout here in the studio. Richard Ashworth and Michael Cashman, many thanks to both of you. And on the line, Walter Böttcher, Peter Klepper and Richard Templer. And for me, Paul Anderson, many thanks indeed for joining us and for sending in your comments. And until next time.